Morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of PLA with myself, Bruno. And today we've got a special guest by Claire from Nick's team. Welcome, Claire, and thank you very much for joining us for this week's episode.
Thank you.
So we've got two questions today, and the first one we will do, we'll go ahead with yourself, Bruno, and of course, Claire, you are welcome to chip in there because you are a special guest today. And then, Bruno. So this one is a security question, Bruno. There's been two breaks-in that were reported at a unit that these agents manage. The first one was in December, and the second one now in February. The tenant decided to move out immediately due to, obviously, they feared for their safety. In the process of the break-in, a lot of expensive items belonging to the tenant were taken away up to the amount of 80,000 Rand. Right. And then the owner is obviously the owner now. Here's where the dispute comes in. The owner has yet to repair the door that was broken during the actual break-in. Right. The tenant has now moved out without notice and without paying the rent for March, which from the agent's understanding is, of course, a breach, which does allow the owner to claim damages in terms of loss of income from the rent. As we know, the tenant obviously feared for their safety, and the unsafety of the property has not been addressed, I believe, and the safety issues. And they've got no proof that these issues have been addressed, actually. The owner is yet to replace the door, and the agent does feel that this means that the owner did not ensure after the break-in that the tenant lives in a habitable property. With the above in mind, does the tenant does not want to pay rent, and the owner is claiming rent from the tenant. So what is basically the outcome in this case then, Bruno?
Look, it's difficult to give an exact outcome, especially with security issues. It's specifically because we do live in a country where security issues are common. And whether it's crime, break-ins, hijackings, that sort of thing, it's not something that you can be very surprised by. And having an expectation placed on your landlord that no security issue, you'll never experience any security issue while you stay under his roof, is not something. Apologies for that. While you stay under his roof is not something that it just forms a standard implied kind of warranty in any lease agreement. In fact, on the contrary, if a landlord would ever want to make a promise like that, it would have to be very expressly stated in the lease agreement that for all intents and purposes, this person is kept absolutely safe. There would be no crime. The security is impenetrable. But obviously we know that's not possible. So then we start looking at things that the landlord has done that could potentially have placed a tenant in some form of risk. Now, normally with the first break-in or second break-in, if it's happening in the area especially, there's very little that a landlord can actually do to prevent it from happening. I mean, crime is crime. So in those instances, my argument is that a tenant does not have any entitlement to cancel a lease agreement based on the fact that there has been a break-in. Like I said, there is no obligation on the landlord to warrant against break-ins. That being said, if there is a break-in and there's damage to the property, that is a different story entirely. Because remember, a landlord is obligated to maintain the structure of the property, which would typically include things like security gates, doors, and the like. So now, if there has been a break-in and the landlord has taken no reasonable steps to place the property back in the position or the structure that it was in prior to the break-in, if there's no steps made by the landlord, then arguably the landlord could be in breach of his obligations in the lease agreement to attend to repairs and that sort of thing. The question of supplementing security or increasing security is entirely separate to that, because again, there it goes down to what's reasonable. Does a landlord now have to up the security given that there's a spate of crimes? That's an arguable fact. But at the very least, placing everything back the way that it was, my contention or my submission with that is that the landlord has to do that. If he fails to do that, arguably he is in breach and the tenant would be entitled to cancel the lease agreement based on the terms of the lease agreement. So you can't just walk out, because that is not what the lease agreement usually says. The lease agreement requires him to give notice of a breach, to require the landlord to remedy the breach, upon which he'd be entitled to cancel. So I think there's a bit of fault on everyone's side here. The landlord should have done something, but the tenant should have acted appropriately. Simply leaving and storming out and not giving any sort of notice means that he didn't properly terminate that lease agreement. And because he didn't properly terminate that lease agreement, he would still be liable in terms of the lease agreement. Yeah, I don't know, Claire, if you agree with that.
I do agree. I think, just to add, there was the agent, there was a lot of, the use of the word breach versus a damages claim that the landlord potentially has against the tenant. My argument would be that the landlord actually, or the tenant, has a right in terms of the CPA to an early cancellation. Now, the fact that there was consecutive break-ins in a relatively short space of time, yes, it's unfortunate, but 100% I do agree with you that is totally beyond the control of the landlord, and would, in this instance, constitute an early cancellation, which is governed by Section 14 of the CPA. And this is obviously assuming that the CPA applies.
Sure.
And that is subject to giving the required 20 business days notice, and also subject to the landlord's right to claim an early cancellation penalty. So as far as damages are concerned, I would say not damages claim, but rather a penalty. We know that the CPA speaks to a reasonable cancellation penalty. Lease agreements these days should ideally move to clarify what that damages claim would be in such an instance. I think more often than not, it's between 2 and 3 months. The landlord, however, has a right to, or a duty rather, to mitigate damages by trying to find a replacement tenant as soon as possible. Also, I just wanted to add that it is, the damages that were suffered in terms of what was stolen. I think they even mentioned that the gas stove was stolen, and all my days I've never heard of the theft of a stove. But anyway, yeah. So that the tenant is actually required to keep insurance or insure his personal belongings in for instances like these.
Absolutely. Yeah, cool. So thank you very much for that question, guys. And